Nikos Erinakis, Director of Research of ENA, Institute for Alternative Policies, and it is a true delight and honor to have the chance to discuss today with such distinguished speakers, who I will introduce in a moment. First things first, I would like to thank Delphi Economic Forum and its people for having us. Year after year, the forum becomes even more excellent, and it is a true pleasure for us to be part of it. I'd like to introduce our speakers and mention, and I cannot stress this enough, how happy and proud we are to have them. I'll begin alphabetically. Albena Asmanova, a reader in political and social thought, University of Kent. Nadia Urbinati, Kyriakos Tsakopoulos Professor of Political Theory at Columbia University. And Göran Therborn, Emeritus Professor, Wolfson College at University of Cambridge. So thank you very much for being here with us today. And I think we'll have a very, very interesting and fruitful discussion together. If you allow me, I'll just make a short introduction of our main topics, and then I'll just pass you the word. So, the title of our panel session today is The Future of Democracy in a World of Uncertainty. And the main idea of us in ENA and how we actually approach this multiple crisis that we experience in a global, European, but also local, national level, is that threats to democracy are one of the most critical challenges today. And in the age of what we now call the Fourth Industrial Revolution and all forms of digitalization, it seems that all types of inequalities still remain, and the climate crisis, the pandemic, and populism fuel generalized uncertainty that erodes the normative foundations of very democracy and limits citizens' trust in democratic institutions. So, what we may call the digitalization of society and economy is, on the one hand, an unstoppable accelerating process, which, on the other hand, can and should be shaped in favor of societal, environmental, and humanitarian aims. Thus, in order not to be very too long, and actually give you all the time to present your ideas and arguments on the topic. Just to mention that the main aim of our discussion today is to attempt altogether to explore potential answers to questions such as what are the dangers that democracy faces nowadays in the dawn of the 21st century? How can they be dealt with? And the main, let's say, meta question that it's, are we experiencing the end of democracy, at least as we know it, or possibly a promising rebirth of it in the new era that we are experiencing? So, Albena, if you agree, if we may, we can begin with you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be a part of this discussion. And let me directly address the issue. Our societies are on the verge of a radical overhaul of their socioeconomic model. We actually live in very exciting times of a social change that is about to happen. Two such transformations, great transformations, have taken place over the past 100 years. The first one was the first one generated the post-war welfare state. Karl Polanyi described it in his work. The second created the neoliberal model of the late 20th century. Now, both of these great transformations were enabled by a wide cross-ideological consensus among the main political forces about the direction in which we need to move. Now, a third tectonic shift is now underway. The overarching idea now is the democratization of capitalism. This is where everybody seems to agree. The idea has two components. a political one about participatory democracy. We need more participation. Very strongly now expressed in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And an economic component, and this is about fighting inequality and increasing worker participation in company boards. The idea of the democratization of capitalism along these two dimensions is somewhat misguided, I want to argue. It is misguided because it is based on the wrong diagnosis of what is wrong with contemporary capitalism. The grave social problem of our time, from rising inequality, the upsurge of populism, the climate crisis, are not causes of global uncertainty, but its consequences. Now let's look at the causes. A combination of factors, from automation, globalization, that is competition in globally integrated markets, cuts in social provision. All these are linked. I have no time to address the specific causality, but all of these factors in combination have generated massive economic instability for ordinary citizens, for men and women, young and old, skilled and unskilled workers, for the middle classes and the poor alike. The main driver of this process is the policy imperative to maintain competitive in global markets. So the policy imperative of competitiveness. Sometime early in the new century, this imperative, policy imperative of competitiveness, replaced that of competition that had been the policy commitment in the late 20th century. This might seem like a minor shift, but it's a very important shift, because maintaining competition in the global economy is achieved via antitrust policy, by breaking monopolies. Competitiveness is achieved via boosting the competitive advantage companies already have in the global economy. So we have the famous policy of building national champions. Also, for the sake of maintaining national competitiveness, states reduced job security and slashed budgets for public services. This kind of rule I have described in my recent book, Capitalism on Edge, as a socially irresponsible rule. It might be responsive to specific pressures coming from society. So public government set policy objectives might be according to, real interest in society, but without taking into consideration the larger and longer term impact on society. This policy approach has tremendous social impact. While competitive pressures have been reduced on a handful of companies, these pressures have augmented for the rest of society. As a result, our societies became afflicted by what I like to call an epidemic of precarity, of politically generated economic and social insecurity, which is actually the main objective of my book. This state of fragility, it does not apply only to what Guy Standing, the great British sociologist Guy Standing, has called the precariat, those on poorly paid insecure jobs, but also on the labor market insiders, the highly skilled and the way paid who work ever longer hours out of fear of job loss and other forms of financial and social insecurity. Thus, the COVID pandemic was in fact enabled, or the economic and social crisis that it generated, was enabled by this epidemic of precarity, because public authority did not have the governing capacity to handle a public health crisis. That is why we are in a situation of perpetual crisis management with random, incoherent, often absurd policy action. So this is the kind of socioeconomic and political system we need to change now. Now, let me explain why we cannot fix this through more political and economic democracy. On political democracy, the problem was spotted already 200 years ago by Alexis de Tocqueville. Much as he was a fan of democracy, as we all are, of course, he noted that democracy tends to prioritize the short-term perspective, and the democratic vote translates people's valid preoccupations about their immediate livelihood into binding policy. This is the infamous problem of political presentism, the focus on the present. Now, precarity aggravates further this tendency to be preoccupied with the present. People become, in conditions of economic and social insecurity, people become even more conservative. They long for security. We have the phenomenon of the rise of the vote to the center right and even to the far right during the Great Recession. So people were radicalized to the right more so than to the left, against the expectation of left parties. So it is neither reasonable nor even fair to expect that people would effectively prioritize the end of the world concerns over the end of the month worries, to use the famous wording of one yellow vest protester. So an enhanced participatory democracy, I'm afraid, is in fact likely to channel these conservative, even reactionary preferences into policy exactly when what we need is a radical transformation of our socioeconomic system. So people in times of precarity lose their taste for radical social transformation. Let me address the next component of the democratization of capitalism idea, on economic democracy. To put it simply, even if we obtain perfect equality through radical redistribution of wealth, this will not make our society much less precarious, because we remain trapped in this thinking of comparing the situation of individuals rather than thinking about strengthening the commons. Now, where is the problem? In conditions of globally integrated markets, even state-owned companies or companies owned by the workers would behave like profit-seeking entities. Think China. So neither redistribution nor enhanced worker participation would fix precarity. Involving workers in the company's management would actually only increase their vested interest in the capacity of their company to pursue profit, with all the familiar negative impact on human beings and nature, from self-exploitation, poor work-life balance, mental health disorders, and extractive economic practices that destroy the ecosystem. So it seems to me that if we want more democracy, as of course we all do, we need to think of the enabling conditions of constructive, transformative democratic participation. And those I see as a matter of serious overhaul of a political economy of European societies away from the pressures of the profit motive. In other words, we cannot blame capitalism for eroding democracy and try to reverse that erosion with more democracy. What we need is less capitalism. So we need to fight, above all, precarity, to replace the focus of prosperity that currently dominates the discourse, the focus on affluence, with a focus on economic stability. This is what people actually are craving. They're craving economic stability. And concerns with inequality are actually a symptom of insecurity. When we're insecure, we and cannot rely on a robust welfare state, we become more dependent on personal wealth. So how do we act on this? How do we fix all that? In my book, I list a list of measures of very mundane, actually, reforms that I call a political economy of trust. here I will focus only on two things. We need to strike at the source of the problem. We need to insulate the European economy from the nefarious pressures of global economic competition. This can be done, of course, not by repatriation industries at home, but by including very high standards of labor and environmental protection in trade treaties. This is the moment for the US and Europe to make this happen. So the first thing is to reform globalization. The second thing is to reduce the consideration of profit in domestic policy making. And it is known what we have to do in order to do that. So we just need to have the political guts to do it. I will stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Albena, for your beautifully put and raised insights. Very fruitful indeed. So, Nadia, the floor is yours. We're waiting to listen to you.
I'm going actually to continue and to profit from this excellent presentation. And I will start precisely from the celebration of the 200th anniversaries of Greece national independence. That was the beginning of the kind of democracy we feel that is in crisis today. That democracy or democratization process started with the idea of putting at the center the nation and the demos, ethnos and demos, the condition of cultural or historical definition of the people, along with the political definition of the people as made of equal citizens. This was at least an open door for the future. So, in my view, it is that kind of democracy that today is in a process of transformation, and not from today, because the process started with the European integration, for instance, in our continent. So the question of borders, thus, not only because this implies that the condition of sovereign community changes with the open of borders and the possibility of having a mixed population with differences inside it sometimes may be used as a strategy for political parties to mobilize against one part of the population against the other one. So the question of plurality of ethno-plurality or religious plurality inside of our communities can be an object of contestation, as we know, every day today, every time, in many cases, even in our today's politics. So the question of borders. This implies, in my view, another form of problems, which was raised by Robert Dahl, the question of the size of democracy. Now, enlargement and expansion of borders in order to create conditions that are more profitable for stability in today's democratic societies, this was one of the issues that brought many Europeans to think that the gradual integration of their countries would be a good condition. In fact, it is a good condition for freedom and from peace within this Enlightenment tradition or Kantian tradition, but it poses problems to democracies, which has, since the beginning of its trajectory in the Athenian time, the problems of size. And the problems of size, it was traditionally solved in the 19th century with the representation and gradually expansion of the electoral component until the conquest of universal suffrage. This was already a problem of instability in many European societies. And today, in my view, the instability of many our democracies has to do precisely with the tension that the expansion of the political community outside of the national community has brought to us. This doesn't need to sound anti-European. On the contrary, it is, however, a challenge that the European Union needs to take into account in order to combine together size and new forms of democracy, size and new forms of deliberative forms of democratic participation. This cannot be is a problem that cannot be overcome and ignored. Size. That requires different forms of institutions. Another issue that is, in my view, very important for understanding the difficulties that many democracies have today in advancing their decision-making system is the following. Democracy presumes that all decisions people make are changeable. The changeability and the reversibility, the amendability of all decisions. This is the condition for democracy to claim to be the political power of the demos over their own life and over their own territory. However, today more and more we see that there are issues in relation to which the decision cannot be reversible and cannot be changeable. There are issues that impose on us kind of final decisions or decisions that don't allow us to change. One case is the example, of course, is the one that we know very well, is the ecology and the degradation of the situation of our globe and our life. So there are decisions that need to be made, and perhaps the democracy cannot be even the best way of making them because they require some quickness, some form of competence we don't know, but they also require that the decisions are to be made quickly and without thinking that there can be in the future a better solution to those problems that are not today approached and solved. So changeability. The third one is authoritarianism. In my view, the integration with the other countries, the interactions between democratic and non-democratic countries has brought to the floor the effectiveness, the capability of some non-democratic forms of decision-making and forms of regimes, the ability that they have to quickly answer and sometimes also to answer effectively. This was even more proved with the pandemic, with the COVID that we suffered in the last 13 months. Now, this has brought many scholars in the west side of the globe to think of democracy or to reflect upon democracy, whether it is indeed the last or best form of decision making, and whether it cannot be integrated with or contaminated with forms that are not necessarily democratic. Before me, I mean, our common guest, she mentioned this presentism in the electoral system of decision making. Well, in many sense, this is also the criticism made, the criticism of democracy made from the point of view of authoritarian regimes, which claim that are capable better than the democratic ones to solve issues of disagreements without entering in the panoply of conflicts and instability that elections imply. So democracy thus has three forms of challenges in front of itself: size, changeability of decisions, and other forms of decision making that shows not necessarily worse than or more ineffective than democracy. Finally, and I come to a conclusion, in my view, but I'm not an economist, so I rely on what the economists have to tell us, the question of how much inequality democracy can bear. How much inequality means not simply inequality per se, but the processes that creates inequality in the power citizens have to make themselves heard and to have the perceptions to have power to be heard and power to be capable of influencing the decision making of their states. So this is the fourth and perhaps even more radical, in my view, challenge today that has to do with the formation, with the separation within the sovereignty called the democratic sovereignty of two parts. It is as if democracy becomes more republican, Athens becomes more equal to Rome, just to have the example of the past. Meaning not one demos, but two. The few with their own institutions, their own international organizations, their own sometimes even councils capable to solve problems according to their interest in terms of basic rights of property and exploitation of the territory. And the other one is the many, the so-called people, the many. So this kind of break inside of the sovereignty, which is not formal, of course, formal is not, but is factual, because de facto many citizens realize that they have the same kind of power of interference, of influencing the decision making of their countries, and finally of Europe, as the other part of the population. So I want to stop here. I feel that I am even I am a little bit pessimistic too, but doesn't mean that this is bad. I mean, pessimism is what our reasoning implies that we should see. We should see things as unfortunately are, in order to be perhaps more capable of giving ourselves good objectives and goals and strategic interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like the famous saying goes, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yeah, a little bit. Exactly.
Nadia, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation with really strong arguments. Thanks indeed. Now, Göran, last but of course not least, we are waiting to hear you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I think that the current crisis of liberal democracy has to be understood from its historical background, its contemporary social context, and with respect to its political future. Currently, democracy is being undermined and eroded by three major tendencies. First of all, democracy is being emptied of political content as government of the people, for the people, and by the people, and turned into a game of professional players playing the procedural game of competitive elections, coached by an increasingly international set of consultants on electoral management. Modern democracy came about as compromises between, on one side, social movements fighting for democracy as a path to human dignity and equality and social justice, working class movements, women's movements, anti-colonial movements, ethnic civil rights movements, and on the other, basically anti-democratic forces of established power and privilege. Secondly, democracy is being undermined by an elitist, financial capital-driven inequality, rising with the deindustrialization of the global north, economically abandoning the middle as well as the popular classes, and socially contemptuous of the populace, the basket of deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called them. The ratio distance of disposable income between the top 1% and the median income earners increased between 1980 and 2016 from 11 to 26 in the United States, from 7 to 11 in Germany, and from 3.5 to almost 11 in Sweden. The limited appeal of liberal democracy in today's Russia is understandable if we look at it together with the fact that the post-Soviet US overlordship of Russia in the 1990s sent Russian national income per adult back to its relative level before the revolution, at below 40% of Western European income, down from 75% almost. Thirdly, the public sphere is being intoxicated by the spread of lurid falsehoods through the amplifiers of the anonymous connectivity of new social media, driven by unscrupulous politicians and media entrepreneurs. For instance, by the end of March this year, 6 of 10 US Republicans still believe that Trump won the November presidential election. General erosion tendencies are underscored by the blatant dysfunctionality of the world's 3 largest democracies of India, United States, and the European Union. India, with its with its extra-legal, so-called informal economy and its persistent caste politics, recently aggravated by official religious prejudice and discrimination. And the United States, with its monetarized politics, in which 2/3 of citizens believe that most politicians are corrupt, its clumsy indirect presidential election, and its enduringly racist police and law enforcement system. And the EU is operating as a co-opted elite of commissioners and secretive judges overriding national democracies and national referenda. After the twin crisis of the financial crash of 2008 and the pandemic of 2020-21, with the horrendous mismanagement of both, the neoliberal, neoconservative prescription of minimizing democratic government is receding. In 1981, Ronald Reagan proclaimed, "In the present crisis, the government is not the solution to our problems. The government is the problem." But in response to the pandemic crisis, the economic stimulus payouts of the US government under both Trump and Biden are the biggest in US history, as well as in today's world. However, the pandemic has increased inequalities, both economic and vital in terms of health and life expectancy. When the pandemic relief runs out, the positions of the middle classes, ordinary workers, and the poor are weaker than before, while the wealthy few are wealthier than ever. Over the future of democracy and of the 20th century hang the 2 clouds of the geopolitics of world hegemony and of climate change, both entering critical choices in the next 2 decades. The US defense of its supremacy and China's challenge of it for a bipolar or multipolar world are likely to invoke popular mobilization, i.e. a potential of more democracy. On the other hand, the space for critical discussion and dissent is likely to narrow in both countries, including, perhaps above all, among the subalterns of the US world, for example, in Europe. The future world politics of how to cope with climate change has no historical precedent and is therefore even more difficult to predict. Probably it will be both more elitist and more movement activist than geopolitics. Save the planet is likely a less popular slogan than Keep America First or Equality for China. In climate politics, there will be, on the one side of action, the committed scientific expertise with its resonance among technocratic politicians and businessmen, middle class and youth activists, mainly from the north, and indigenous movements primarily from the south. On the side of no or little action to meet the climate challenge, we are likely to find the mainstream of religious and secular conservatism and traditionalism, vested business interests in consumerism as well as in fossil fuels, workers in non-green sectors fearing for their jobs. One possible scenario of this constellation would be something like the opposite of the likely geopolitical one. The technocratic elite and the activist minority may come to the conclusion that not taking speedy, decisive action, the ecological adaptation, would imperil the survival of the planet, and Albena referred to that as well, and that therefore ordinary democratic procedures have to be dispensed with, while letting disgruntled people free to murmur their disagreement. The 20th century achieved the victories of modern democracy. In the 21st, they are being hollowed out, but are not reversed yet. We are still living on our diminishing inheritance. The economic and epidemiological crisis opening our century, and the geopolitical and climate clouds darkening our coming decades do not promise any revitalization of democracy. However, we all know that promises of politics are seldom to be trusted. So to and by actors of this century, anything can happen.
Great. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation with all this, spherical around argumentation. Thank you very much indeed. I was planning to actually raise a question and to discuss it all together. Try to approach potential answers. Although unfortunately we don't have enough time left. But I thought that I could raise it and just leave it open with the wish that we could actually have a future conversation all together again and try to answer it then. So in an attempt to also to sum up what you mentioned and all the interesting and really strong arguments that you raised, I was thinking that, going back to the beginning, that indeed the digitalization of society and economy, also based on the artificial intelligence and artificial creativity, is apparently an unstoppable accelerating process, which may be either optimistic or pessimistic, we shall see, but which can and should be shaped in favor of at least societal and environmental and humanitarian aims, in a deeply democratic sense. So, yet it is not very clear how far digitalization can be linked to goals of society and whether it can be placed at the services of global transformation towards also an ecological sustainability. And the question was, if in your opinion, how the main goal of deeper democratization of our societies can actually help towards this direction, and of course how this can be achieved in a very pragmatic sense. For the time being, I'll just leave it here in the sphere, and we could actually be able to discuss it, I really hope and wish, in the near future. So, once again, thank you very much. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you and make this rather short, but I think very deep and interesting discussion. Thanks again to the Delphi Economic Forum for hosting us, and I hope to see you all soon again.
Right.
Thank you all for your
Thank you.
Comments.